You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. There was a time earlier this century. Vintners, brewers, and distillers must have been thanking their lucky stars, excitedly circulating reports indicating a little alcohol might even improve health. Resveratrol, a component in the skins of grapes and berries, thus in trace amounts in red wine, had its moment in the sun. Moderation was the watchword. Those reports, often badly transmitted, have been overtaken, swamped by a new generation of research which indicates the healthy amount of alcohol is no alcohol. But alcoholic beverages, beer, rum, whiskey, wine, are deeply embedded in American history, our culture, in trade patterns, in the histories of different ethnic groups coming to America, settling in parts of the country suited to different kinds of agriculture. It's there in tax law, government enforcement of regulation, 19th century temperance, 20th century prohibition, smuggling, gangsters, noir movies. Alcohol history is American history. We're not going teetotal anytime soon, but just as with tobacco, big cultural presence, historical centrality doesn't make the legal drug any healthier. Roni Rabin is a health reporter for the science desk of the New York Times. Her recent coverage focuses on maternal and child health, racial and economic disparities in healthcare, and the influence of money on medicine. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Well, recently we did a program with Stanford University's Keith Humphreys, and he was talking about how much drinking rose, especially among boomers, during the pandemic. But we spent a lot less time on just how dangerous light and moderate drinking can be. What did the recent Journal of the American Medical Association study find?
We've always had this idea that moderate drinking has had this health halo around it, that it's actually good for you and reduces deaths from heart disease in particular. But there were a lot of flaws in that research, and there's a whole paradigm shift going on where the methodologies in the research are being corrected, or the researchers are saying they're correcting them. We've got the alcohol industry is pushing back on that. But the new research suggests that there's no benefit to light drinking. I mean, we know heavy drinking's bad for you. There's no question about that. Nobody's arguing about that. Heavy drinking's bad for you. It's bad for your body. It causes accidents. It causes liver disease, heart disease, cancer. But there's always this question about light drinking. And now what they're finding is that they're not seeing any reduction in heart disease deaths among light drinkers. And they do see a slight uptick in cancer. This was a very sophisticated study. And what they looked at was, they actually broke it down further and said, well, how are people drinking and who's drinking? And the risk, this uptick in cancer was seen particularly in people who were in frail health, had some health problems, or had some socioeconomic vulnerability, people from lower income areas. And it only looked at people 60 and over. So you can imagine there are a lot of people in that age group who have some health problems already. But the main message is, don't delude yourself this is good for you, okay? For some people, there may not be an actual risk added at the light level, but it's not helping you with heart disease. And there may be an increase in cancer as well.
Well, the journal finding that alcohol consumption is a leading cause of morbidity and mortality, even more than socioeconomic and health-related factors. That caught my eye because I always wonder, I mean, here we are, we're talking about one of the largest populations on the planet. We're talking about north of 330 million people. How do you tease out correlation and causation? How do you tease out that straight line between moderate alcohol consumption and an elevated risk of some of these, rather than, as you mentioned, other lifestyle and socioeconomic factors that may be pressing on an individual's health?
Well, what you're talking about is what the scientists call confounders. Like, yeah, you're comparing these people to each other. They're different in many ways. And one concern that a lot of the scientists have had for a long time is that when you look at moderate drinkers who are drinking, in the US, it's been defined as up to 2 drinks a day for men and up to 1 for women. And there's never been a weekly cutoff for that. Who drinks moderately? These people often are moderate in a lot of other ways. They're moderate in their habits overall. So they may also exercise. They may also eat well. They don't have other bad extreme habits. And that is a confounder. So you don't know how much the moderate drinking is playing a role and how much their other lifestyle, the way they eat, the way they exercise, the way they socialize, all these things that we now contribute to long-term health. So it is really difficult to tease that out. And one of the things that this study also looked at, in addition to looking at who's vulnerable, is how they drink and what they're drinking. And they did find, for the vulnerable people only, that drinking wine and drinking only with meals set off that, what they call attenuated, kind of cut down that harmful impact of the light drinking for those people, for the people who are already vulnerable. Now, why? We don't know why. Is wine really good for you? In the amount of resveratrol in wine, you'd really have to drink a lot to get a significant amount. So we don't really think it's the resveratrol. Drinking while you're eating, your blood alcohol content in the amount of alcohol in your blood doesn't go up as quickly when you're drinking with a meal. That seems to be part of it. People who are drinking wine are kind of different than people who drink beer and distilled spirits. They're different in other ways, right? It tends to be a different demographic. So yeah, it's very hard to tease all these things out. And the big change in this research, though, and this is something that the alcohol industry is particularly pushing back against. When you say that people live longer, no matter what they're doing, who are you comparing it to? Live longer than whom? So the past research has always looked at moderate drinkers compared to what they call abstainers. People don't drink at all. The new scientists are saying, hey, wait a minute, who are abstainers? Who's abstaining? Are they people who are actually former alcohol abusers, people who were drinking too much? Are they already sick? Is that why they stopped drinking? Are they the sick quitters? Are they people who never drank because they have disabilities, because they have chronic illness? And is that what kind of gave us this wrong impression that moderate drinking was actually good for you? We're comparing them to the wrong people. So the alcohol industry doesn't like that change in the way the research is being done. And that's become a big fight now.
It's a big industry, and how research like this lands and then what people do with it are key components of sort of the life cycle of any news story. If you're a primary care physician, and it's a standard part of intake to ask people whether they drink, how much they drink, whether it's been a problem for them. How do you take information like this and weave it into what you're doing? Do you have to then, from now on, tell everybody that you treat, if you can, don't drink, or drink less? Or it would be interesting to know just how somebody in the health profession takes information like this and makes it real to the people they treat.
Doctors are not great with nutritional information anyway. If you talk this about diet and nutrition, that's always been kind of a weak point. It's not exactly a focus of medical school or medical training. One thing that's coming down the pike is the U.S. dietary guidelines. They get updated every 5 years, and they have always said up to 2, lately it's like up to 2 drinks per day for men is okay, up to 1 for women. They've kind of played with the language in terms of what they're really saying. They're not really saying it's good for you. They're saying it's okay. And they're now in the process of updating the guidelines. And it's going to be very interesting the way it plays out, because there's clearly going to be a lot of discussion, let's say, or debate about it. We've got actually 2 different committees that are examining the impact of alcohol on health. One is within the government agencies, and one is being overseen by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, which is a non-governmental group, which was funded by Congress, I believe for the first time, to look at this issue and come up with a report that will affect the U.S. dietary guidelines. And I wrote a story earlier this year about the fact that 2 of the nominees to this committee, who were actually the only nominees who are alcohol researchers, both had ties. One very much previously, but one very controversial ties to the alcohol industry and financial funding from the alcohol industry. After I wrote that story, they were removed and two other nominees replaced them, but they were colleagues of theirs. So there's a lot of fight about who. I mean, the big issue here is also funding. Funding affects findings in science. We have a lot of research actually showing that. And a lot of the early research was funded by the alcohol industry, often by organizations that called themselves something else. They got the money from the alcohol industry. And there seem to be two camps of alcohol researchers, those who accept that kind of money and those who don't. This study, this most recent study, was funded by all public health money in Spain, actually. It was mostly Spanish-based researchers, although the population of the study was from the UK.
I was going to ask you about that because if you spend any time in another country, you maybe see that the social habits, the rhythms of daily life in relationship to alcohol are quite different. And the United Kingdom has really what I would call an entirely different drinking culture from that of the United States. And I wonder if that should at least make us a little cautious when we try to project out what a different place to live in could look like based on this research. The British have as a part of their social understanding of recreation and time spent socially, drinking, and not only drinking, but heavy drinking on occasion. So it's not unusual to see in the streets of cities and towns in the UK publicly drunk people, while in other countries that is considered sort of a social shame, and you wouldn't be seen in that way, and you'd mostly drink at home. Drinking of kind of unimaginable amounts, for instance, of beer. If on a night out somebody drinks 4 pints of beer, imperial pints, that's 2.5 quarts of beer, folks. It's rare to see an American sit down in a restaurant and drink the equivalent of 2.5 quarts of beer. Are there problems with extrapolation when you make a study based on one society?
Possibly, but I think what you're describing is binge drinking, right? Heavy drinking.
Well, it's occasional binge drinking punctuated by regular moderate drinking. So a person may go to the pub 3 or 4 nights a week, but only binge drink on one of those occasions while drinking in all 4.
What you're describing sounds like heavy drinking. If you're talking about, we do have people who binge drink here. I mean, I'm thinking especially among the younger adults in college, we have people who drink to blackout, who definitely, I don't know what they're doing Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday night, but, you know, the weekend in college is extended from Thursday, Friday, Saturday now. I mean, those are all party nights. And we know there's a lot of heavy drinking. And as you noted, during COVID, drinking increased among everyone and very sharply among women. And we're seeing more liver disease and consequences in women, which suggests heavy drinking. If you're also looking at patterns, I mean, the whole social aspect is an issue just because we know that socializing and a healthy social life and social connections are good for you. So if that does play a role somewhere. But I'd be hard-pressed to say that our drinking patterns here are all that different from England without seeing a study.
But to be clear, they extract people who are binge drinkers, and concentrate their attention on people who report being moderate drinkers?
These are really large studies, okay? This was a study of 135,000 adults. And they were all over 60, by the way, which also, your drinking habits may change as you get older, but they're mostly asking them to report. I mean, they're not tracking people and seeing how much they drink. They're asking them, how often do you drink? How much do you drink? So presumably, they're putting them in the different buckets based on that. This study also looked at, as I said, other things, what they're drinking and how they're drinking, their drinking pattern. I mean, moderate drinking in this study is up to 1.5 drinks a day, U.S. standard drinks.
Are there games played with that, as there are with the food pyramid? What a portion is, what a drink is. Do we have to be careful when trying to understand the bottom lines on research like this?
In the UK, a standard drink is smaller than an American standard drink. No surprise there, right? For the purposes of the study. I mean, I don't know about how they're served in the pub, certainly the way they define it in the study. Light drinking in this study was considered was up to 20 grams a day of alcohol. And a standard drink in the U.S. is basically 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, 1.5 ounces of distilled spirits. That's considered a standard drink in the U.S. So this study is saying the light drinkers are 1.5. Above that, it's moderate drinkers and high drinkers. The main headline of this study and the whole kind of trend in this research is it doesn't reduce your risk of heart disease at any level. It may slightly increase your risk of cancer even at low levels. And when I'm talking about slight, it's 10, 15% increasing your risk of cancer. That's not a huge increase, but as people get older, the risk of cancer increases. Cancer has always been considered a disease of aging. And there are particular cancers that it's associated with. And I want to emphasize breast cancer because women fear breast cancer and we have reason to fear breast cancer. And we feel like there's nothing we can do, sort of these radical bilateral mastectomies to reduce our risk of breast cancer. There is. Drinking does increase the risk of breast cancer. It also increases the risk of colon cancer and head and esophageal and head and neck cancers. It is a lifestyle modification if you are concerned about that, if you have this in your family, if you have other concerns and risk factors.
When there's new research like this, as someone who covers this world, what can you observe about how it lands, where it guides scholars to train their fire next, how it affects the advice that the medical community gives to patients? Does it take a while to percolate through? Is it widely distributed early on? Does it get a lot of attention that shapes the next set of proposals for funding for research? What does it do? Once you have something like this in hand, people start to circulate the findings, and then?
Well, I would say that lots of studies are always going on. And then in the scientific world, they do these meta-analyses and reviews where they try to reconcile the differences between them. They try to look at the best studies and conclude. But I'm thinking more of public perception now, right? If you read a story saying that chocolate is good for you, you will remember that every time you see chocolate and you want to eat it if you like chocolate, right? If you see a story that drinking is bad for you or not good for you, you're going to say, I don't know. I can't tell you how many people I talk to and these friends and acquaintances, what they say about alcohol is that it's good for you. It's not necessarily the case. We really are starting to question that. And they'll say, but what about wine? Red wine. I'm like, wine's alcohol. And they're like, what about red wine? I'm like, red wine is alcohol. So in terms of disseminating this, we all have our things that we cling to, and it takes a long time to change the narrative. And this narrative has been very strongly entrenched and pushed and promoted. And the media have played a role in that. And I can still remember vividly, Morally Safer, story from Italy about the wonders of wine. That was probably 20 or 30 years ago. I remember to this day, there were a lot of stories like that.
Oh, every Mediterranean diet story featured elderly people sitting around a convivial table having a bottle of wine.
And one of the scientists in that, one of the lead scientists involved in the Mediterranean diet, was funded by the wine industry.
Is that an X factor? You're someone who covers this world for a living. One night you turn on the TV, plop down on the couch, and there is an anchor person who looks at the same research that you did and finds the sort of one bright spot that reassures people, because that's how we handle these kinds of things, I think. After a lifetime in newsrooms, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the writers sit around the desk and, in addition to the gloom and doom that they deliver from a report like this, they also say, yeah, but, and they may, for instance, in this case, cling to the idea that having it with a meal isn't so bad. And that may become the lead of the way it gets digested, let's say, by the news business.
Yeah, well, that's...
Does it drive you a little crazy?
They call me the queen of gloom and doom, so nobody likes to read my stories. But I think we need to be frank with people. And like I said, the gist of this study is that light drinking does not reduce your risk of heart disease. It doesn't increase your risk of heart disease. So that's the silver lining there. It doesn't increase your risk of heart disease if you're drinking lightly and moderately. Especially it appears if you drink wine and consume the alcohol with meals. However, I think we need to hear that cancer message. I think that's important. Cancer is one of these things. I mean, we actually know a lot about reducing our risk of heart disease through lifestyle factors and taking statins and exercise. We don't really totally understand how to reduce the risk of cancers. So for some people, that's a big concern. Everyone has their own risk averseness, risk. People have different levels of risk they accept in their life. But I think our role as the media is to tell them the truth.
The agencies that monitor American health are filled with civil servants, filled with physicians, filled with political appointees. How do they wrestle out a conclusion that gets delivered to the public? If you are someone who would react to the bare bones findings of the JAMA study and with concern, how likely are you to see those concerns mirrored in the way the government handles this, with its enormous amount of attention paid to research, funding research, and also turning recommendations into guidelines for the public?
There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in what you're talking about. And I'd like to be Pollyanna-ish and think we're going completely based on the evidence. But there are a lot of vested interests. And I'll tell you what happened in Canada recently. The Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction last year came out with a big report. The take-home of their report, based on all this new evolving research, even a small amount of alcohol can be damaging to your health. That's their summary. They have a very simple one-page summary for the general public. They suggest 1 to 2 drinks per week is low risk. That's how they're defining it. 1 to 2 a week, which is the comparison group in this study, which was that's an occasional drinker, really. They say 3 to 6 a week increases cancer risk, and 7 and over a week, stroke and heart disease increase. The Canadian government did not formally adopt this report, which the alcohol industry has been emphasizing to me in particular, but it was getting the message out that, well, the Canadian government did not accept this report. This was the Canadian Substance Abuse Centre, which is a Canadian arm of the Canadian government. But they said, remember, why did the Canadian government not accept it? I don't know. I wasn't in the room. I don't know what was going on. But I suggest that that the Canadian government was not just looking at the evidence from this scientific analysis done by this center.
The soft drink industry sprang into action in response to research on sugar drinks, proposals for taxes on sugar drinks. You saw what the muscle of an industry could mean when it came to carbonated beverages and the way that they are marketed and sold. And all the evidence coming from Mexico on what that could mean to the average person's health, that didn't really matter as much as the sort of sheer brute strength of an industry when it sees a big threat. Is there a version that goes on with alcoholic drinks? Somebody from Mitch McConnell's office making sure they have a word with people who are writing a report because of the importance of distilled beverages to their industrial base. Somebody from the government of California, maybe their governmental affairs director in Washington, making sure they have a word with key personnel because the wine industry is an enormous industry. Beer distributed well across the country, a widely shared corporate interest in keeping it flowing and flowing in large amounts across the country. Is this the kind of thing that gets them energized and twisting arms?
I would say absolutely. I mean, I would say that the alcohol industry and the beer industry and the Distilled Spirits Council and all these groups are very powerful. And that's why, as I alluded earlier, generally all of the evidence preparation for the U.S. dietary guidelines updating is done sort of in-house under the umbrella of either the USDA or HHS, which are the two big government agencies, Health and Human Services and U.S. Agriculture, Department of Agriculture. It's always been done that way. They bring in outside experts, but they are the lead agencies. Suddenly, last year, Congress allocated $1.3 million to the National Academies of Science to do the review. And now they're fighting and they're writing nasty letters to all these government agencies that are trying to do their own review and saying, we gave money to the National Academies of Science. So, yeah, do Congress people get involved and pressured by the industry? Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's going to be really interesting to see how I'm calling it the food fight, the alcohol food fight. Who are the dietary guidelines people going to listen to when they come to write and look at the evidence reports?
So if you and I got together for dinner tomorrow night, would you be ordering a glass of wine?
Oh, sure. Probably. Yeah.
So would I.
But I probably wouldn't order a second one.
There we go. Roni Rabin is a health reporter for the science desk of the New York Times. She covers many aspects of health, including maternal and child health, racial and economic disparities in health care, and the influence of money on medicine. Thanks a lot for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with support from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional engineering was provided by Rob Spate. Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.